So my name is Hannah Huber. I'm a postdoctoral fellow and research associate in digital humanities. And I was hired through a grant that was given by the University of Illinois President's Office to support the arts and humanities. And the grant was co-written by Mary Case, who's the university librarian, and Mark Henwell, who's the director of the Institute for the Humanities. And that grant was called the Digital Humanities Initiative, and so that's what I'm here this year to do to implement. So part of what my job is to be a research kind of consultant for graduate students, faculty, and undergraduates, and then instructors who want to implement DH in the classroom, to kind of help with whatever you need. Help with your interest in DH, if you have a specific project or question or anything like that. I'm here to kind of facilitate that, and I usually work with Brian on that type of thing. And then I'm also organizing the events for the Digital Humanities Initiative for this year. So this workshop is our inaugural event, which is really exciting. And we are going to have a spring workshop, which we haven't quite worked out the details for that yet. And we are going to have a spring conference. And information about that is on the DHI website. And then the third component of my fellowship is to work on my own digital project. So that's kind of something else that I'm working on. So we're hoping that through the initiative we'll be able to introduce everyone at UIC to a foundation for DH, and I think that the workshop really embodies that goal. It's a great starting point for the initiative. So I'm really excited you guys are here. Brian, you want to introduce yourself and talk about the
Some of you know me, I'm Brian Atkinson. I'm getting used to this place. I think the last time I was in this room, I was doing a job talk. So it's been like less than a year, and it's kind of interesting how far we've come. Digital Humanities Initiative sort of jump-started a project at the library to build what was originally one space with resources for digital scholarship in general, and evolved into two separate spaces, about 1,500 square feet, which for a landlocked university, that's, figure like I hit the jackpot. And basically my goal here is to create a smorgasbord, if you will, of tools that you might find someplace on campus, but because you're locked in a particular department or area, you can't use those tools. So for example, if you're in CADA, the College of Arts, Design, and Architecture, right? All right. If you're in one department, you can use their fabrication lab. If you're in a different department, you can't. And so those tools, even if you're faculty or anyone else, those tools will remain kind of off limits and kind of impede scholarship. And so what I'm trying to do is build bridges, for one, and then also provide this basic level of resource here at the UIC Library to allow people to experiment and learn. And so far it's been a lot of fun. We're almost open. January we're open for sure. For any of you who've worked on projects like this at a big university, facilities is your friend and your nemesis at the same time. And sometimes they take a lot longer than you want them to. And so this started, basically the planning for it all started in March. Really didn't finish till about 3-4 weeks ago. And so now we're getting the second piece and start actually outfitting areas, which we'll show you later on today. Thank you for coming. And I think I'll let you do the introductions.
Yeah, so we have Matt Taylor here. Matt has a background in computer engineering, and he is the IT director and general director of the Media and Design Studio at Northwestern, where he supervises all things digital. We have Josh Hahn here. He's the digital humanities librarian at Northwestern, where he collaborates with faculty and students on a range of digital and web-based research and pedagogy projects. So since 2013, Matt and Josh have led Northwestern's yearly Digital Humanities Summer Workshop, which brings together faculty, librarians, and technologists for a 2-week intensive, critical, and collaborative experience in developing digital humanities pedagogy and research projects with meaningful roles for students. Hosted by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities and co-organized by Northwestern University Libraries and the Weinberg College Weinberg College's Media and Design Studio, the Digital Humanities Summer Workshop provides Northwestern Humanities faculty with the opportunity to learn and grow technology skills, think critically about digital information, tools, and culture, conceptualize and collaborate on research and pedagogy projects, and participate in interdisciplinary seminars and discussions. So one really cool current project that they've helped launch is called the Poulter Project, and Josh serves as the digital humanities liaison, and Matt is the technical editor and web developer. The Poulter Project is a website and digital collaboration that aims at allowing readers to engage with multiple different representations and readings of Hester Poulter, who is a 17th century poet and writer whose manuscript was only rediscovered in 1996. The distinctive nature of the project is that it does not adapt an editorial process that strives to establish a single ideal edited form for Poulter's works, but instead endorses multiple, equally authorized versions as a way to foreground the complexity of Poulter's poetics and the affordances of scholarly editing in the digital age. At the core of the site is a tool powered by the versioning machine, which is a framework and interface for displaying multiple versions of text, and it features side-by-side versions of each poem. Instead of providing visitors with a single authorized edition, the site presents a set of possible texts and interpretations, enfolded within a framework that transparently exposes what is at stake in making editorial choices. The project is thus in part an exploration of how to rethink ways of making a writer newly legible and available in the digital age. So I'm really excited to have Matt and Josh here today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hannah and everyone for coming. Thank you to everyone who's helped put on this day and event. It's been really exciting to be a part of, and we're looking forward to lunch later, the tour, and of course the workshop. So before we get started, we just wanted to talk a little bit about Northwestern, the local context where we're at, because while we'll be presenting our views and our opinions and some of our ways of doing digital humanities, I think, and hopefully some of those will be transferable to UIC or to other types of institutions. They really are informed by the kinds of people we're working with on campus. And so Northwestern University is an R1 institution. It's up in Evanston. So we had a question before here, are we ever on the Chicago campus? And not very often. I don't know, it's every now and again, but very rarely. So we're mostly located in Evanston. The school contains about a little over 8,000 undergraduate students and somewhere in the range of 5,000 graduate students. We have a diverse range of humanities, and as you'll see in our definition of digital humanities later, we have a very capacious understanding of what a humanities project is. So we're working with folks from performance studies, English, music, anthropology, kind of all over the map, and whether or not that discipline defines themselves or sees themselves as digital humanities, we leave that up to the individual scholar or graduate student to kind of make that case, or we don't make them make a case for what's humanities or not. We also have Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, as Hannah mentioned, which hosts our workshop. And that's a really robust center that brings in a very great interdisciplinary group of fellows and student fellows, faculty fellows, graduate student fellows throughout the year. It holds really good events, and they have been really key partners for us in spreading the word and having really good collaboration. And one of the ways in which the Kaplan Institute is, we don't have a central DH hub. We don't have a DH hub or DH center in Northwestern. We have a more distributed model. So the Kaplan can become a little home for us in a way to connect people to Matt's group, which we'll talk about in a minute, or the university library, which we'll also talk about. And we've had various discussions over the years about whether or not to have a center. It's not really up to us, right? It's up to the people with money, but we've kind of enjoyed and had successful collaborations across the units and finding our different niches. And to be honest, there aren't many people at Northwestern who define themselves as digital humanists first. So in order, without those kinds of folks, we can kind of take a much broader, lighter approach and kind of include everybody. So that's been really nice.
So we don't have a DH center. What are these centers that do exist? So I'm representing one of those units, which is the Media and Design Studio. But if I was going to explain the Media and Design Studio, I have to first contextualize that it was originally a language lab. And I think this is not unique to Northwestern, where the language lab has evolved through time into something that has sort of always looked at the application of technology towards pedagogy. Of course, maybe in the beginning it was tape cassette players and how you could use this in teaching. But at Northwestern, the language lab gradually morphed into an entity that focused on application of technology toward teaching throughout the College of Arts and Sciences. So a big pivot happened in the mid-90s with the advent of greater access to the web and sort of greater interest in the internet, thinking about how can we start to put more of the scholarship online, how can we start to build projects of some scholastic or scholarly value online. And that's something that really took off for us maybe in the early 2000s with the first set of digital projects that were archive-based. I'm very fortunate to be joined by one of my coworkers from the unit today who will be here available and floating around and also probably chiming in on some projects we discuss. And there I am the IT director. Sergey is the head developer there. And my second hat, sort of owing to this history as a language center, my second hat is on the Council of Language Instruction, where I'm advising them on similar issues of technology and pedagogy.
I'm situated in the library, which is just a stone's throw, a really good stone's throw from where Matt and Sergey sit. I've been doing digital humanities at Northwestern, in the libraries in particular, for about 8 years, and as of a few months ago, I became the English librarian as well, so one of austerity's perks is now I have 2 jobs instead of 1. But I love the English faculty, and it's great. And I've been working with faculty and students, and increasingly now community, so doing community-based projects. And that relates a lot to my work as an affiliate for our it's been about 2 years old, Center for Native American Indigenous Research. So one of my current projects is a grant-funded project as part of the Collections as Data grant to work with the American Indian Association of Illinois on working on the archives of the Native American Educational Services College, which was a Native-centered college in Chicago from 1974 to 2005. That also has satellite campuses across the country in different tribal communities. So we've been working to kind of collect and curate a lot of the archive there in the library collection they had at the university. And then I'll show a few projects that have come out of this group as well. And the university libraries really focuses on, we're really good at high-level digitization. We have a really amazing digitization unit on campus. We also have the Digital Scholarship Services unit, which I'm a part of. It's really made up of 4 people. I do digital humanities. I have a colleague who does digital publishing, one who focuses on copyright and also works with our press. And then we have another one doing data management, which is more in the sciences. And really we see the library as a place anyone is welcome to, and we make connections and collaborations across campus. So we try to make a welcoming, inclusive space, and then use our connections around campus to point people in the right direction. So sometimes people come to me and they end up working for Matt or with Matt, whether he's happy about it or not. And so yeah, we just try to kind of we hope to be a hub to just kind of bring people in together. And just really quickly going back to this kind of idea of a distributed model. So these are the websites of all our institutions: the Media and Design Studio, the University Libraries, and the Alice Capital Studio for the Humanities. And one thing we'll close on with this talk is talking about this workshop that Hannah mentioned earlier. We've been doing a yearly workshop since 2013 with faculty where they come in for a 2-week intensive skills training, project building, team building, all sorts of things we focus on. So we'll come back to that, but that's kind of really become our kind of, in a way, our organizing event across campus.
Right. It's everything we wish we could do in 3 hours today, except for that we have 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, now 1 week. We're trying to compress
austerity
a little.
strikes again. Yeah.
Yes.
Austerity might be a theme of our presentation. So before...
We'll have to bring you guys back.
What's that?
We'll have to just bring you guys back.
Yeah, we'll just do a slow burn. Yeah. So before we get started with our presentation, we really wanted to go. I feel like the group is good enough size to just go around and hear your names, maybe what department you're in, or your affiliation, maybe grad student or faculty member. It'd just be nice to hear from folks. And we'll have a couple more times throughout this first presentation to ask questions and stuff, but mind starting?
Sure. So my name is Glenda Insua, and I am a librarian here at the USC Library.
I'm Katie Brown. I'm a visiting assistant professor in Spanish.
I'm Gabrielle Hall, and I'm a graduate student.
I'm Zoe Martin Lockhart, and I am an Edinburgh graduate student.
I'm Bill Lockhart, and emeritus professor from the University of Utah Law School, visiting my daughter.
Welcome.
Oh, welcome, yeah.
I'm Dawn Simon, and I'm the senior lecturer in Chinese program, and also a PhD student in the Germanic studies.
I'm Caroline from the English department.
Stephen Engelman, political science.
Yes, a second class student, philosophy and linguistics. And I'm co-assistant professor in criminology and linguistics.
Peggy Blowacki, I'm the manuscripts librarian and special collections.
Sergey.
I'm Sergey Kalugin, developer at Media Design.
Yvonne Alec, I'm a digital humanities postdoc at Language and Culture University.
I'm Ariel Moss. I'm an assistant professor of African American Studies and Anthropology.
Awesome, thank you. Just good to get a sense of, where people are coming from and what departments are around, so thank you for that. So, we're starting off,
Esther Martin, I'm a cultural studies in LAS, and I'm a studies.
welcome.
So a pretty varied group of people, grad students, faculty, people from English, poli-sci, anthropology, sort of the same mix that we have at Northwestern, so we're very happy to have this wide representation here.
So we wanted to start off today with the question that everyone starts off with digital humanities, which is the shrug emoticon. What is digital humanities? And I usually start off my presentations with this because I think it's a little bit funny. So there's this website called whatisdigitalhumanities.com, and every time you go to it, you can refresh it, and it'll show you a new definition of digital humanities. And there's over 800 definitions on there, and that's just from a single blog from 2009 to 2014. So I'd imagine it's even more out of control nowadays. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's something that there have been a lot of growing pains in the past years about digital humanities. Like, what is it? Folks have used it to kind of instrumentalize certain things or professionalize certain things. And so one of the things we wanted to do is just to set up this very capacious and broad definition of digital humanities. And especially in my work as a librarian, I'm meeting with folks from any kind of discipline, from undergrads to faculty members. So we really see it as interdisciplinary humanities research, teaching, learning, and publishing that's presented in digital forms, enabled by digital methods and tools, experimenting with digital technologies, about digital technology and culture, so inclusive of media studies and those kinds of programs. And then also something that's critical of its own digitalness, and I'll give an example of each of these. And these are not exclusive categories. Many times the projects include all of these. So an example of something that's presented in digital forms is something like the Women Writers Project, which is a very popular, famous DH project that's been around since at least the 90s. Mm-hmm. And like a lot of early DH projects, it's an archive or a collection of texts. This particular being women's texts or women-authored texts. And it's gone through different iterations. Now there's visualizations and things like that on there. But this is something that's very much presented in digital form type of project. Something that almost like mimicking a library collection but online, right? And then being enabled by digital methods, something like the tool Palladio, which if you have a spreadsheet of data or you have data that you want to get into a form that's usable for visualizations, Palladio is a really great, simple, easy, and free tool online to bring that data in, to map it over space, but also to do things like this, network visualizations that can kind of show relationships. So relationships to people, to the journals they published in, or relationships between, books and different texts and that sort of thing. So there's different ways to use this data, use the data you have to visualize it. So that's something kind of enabled by digital tools. And when things are enabled by digital tools, they don't always end up in a digital form, right? You might just be using this to say, I want to make sense of all these things I digitize in an archive, or I want to make sense of this data that I have, and I want to like use this tool to refine my research questions. So oftentimes, especially when graduate students use this software, they're not creating a digital part of their dissertation. They're not looking to make an interactive component, but their research still needs these methods. And then experimenting with digital technology, it can take a lot of forms. I really like this project by two Korean artists, conceptual artists. It's called Cloudface. And they've taken facial recognition technology and pointed it at the sky. And so it's identifying clouds, or identifying faces in the clouds. And this is a very creative way to think about things about like surveillance, prevalence of surveillance in our society, or to think about this kind of myth that's been created by Microsoft and IBM and those of the cloud as this ephemeral thing that doesn't have kind of material effects. And so I think it's a really interesting way to kind of take a humanities approach to the digital. And not just use digital. Yeah. What's that?
Everybody see the face?
The GIF is too fast to see it. Everyone always asks me, where's the face? But if you go to their website, there's lots of still shots, and there are some really fantastic faces on there. Something that's about digital technology, more explicit examples might be books like Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, which looks at the ways in which Google's black box algorithms kind of promote and further enable racist stereotypes, especially for black girls and women. But Documenting the Now is a really fantastic digital humanities project that looks at what does it mean to be an activist in the social media age, and how do we archive and curate these thousands and millions of tweets? How do we use that to combat maybe a public narrative that CNN or Fox News or someone's presenting a protest? And how do we do this all in an ethical way? So it's really thinking about how do we engage the kind of born digital things of our culture, and how do we create the proper processes to archive those for future generations, but also to put them to use and for good means in the present. And even though Documenting Now has created so many tools that you can use to like collect tweets and things like that, one of the biggest benefits of it is that they've created a kind of an ethics and pedagogy around this kind of work. So it's a really great place to do if you're interested in any kind of social media-based research. They're a great place to start to write papers. And then an example of something being critical of its own digitalness, and that's, I think, thinking about the ways in which digital technology affects and limits or promotes the kinds of narratives you want to tell. Mukurtu, I don't know how many folks have heard of Mukurtu, but it's a really wonderful software for collection building, similar to Omeka, which we'll look at later, which many more people have probably heard of. And Mukurtu was designed with indigenous communities, so originally with the Waramungu people in Australia. And the goal of this software is to, like being on Twitter or like being on WordPress or any kind of platform, we mostly have an option of being a private account or a public account. We don't really negotiate any kind of more diverse protocols. Many indigenous communities have much more robust cultural protocols. So say only women know this kind of information or share this kind of information, or at this time of year this information is shared. Mukurtu is a software that from the ground up enables indigenous communities, tribes, nations to implement their cultural protocols in the way they archive and share their digital cultural heritage material. So it's a very powerful software, both in concept and technically as well. So really quick, a question for the room, by show of hands, how many folks have participated in digital humanities projects or been a part of one? All right, so a few people. DH postdoc, of course. Do you have, you raised your hand, so I'm going to call on you. What kind of project did you work on, and do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
I'm working on a project right now, so I'm looking to get some input from you guys. Right now I'm trying to put together a digital database that includes poetry, anthology, tables of contents from the modernist period, so that you could sort and figure out who appears in which years most frequently, and you could sort them by other things like by women or African-American poets or lesbian poets, so a way of sorting the names that appear in albums.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, and we can definitely talk about that. Palladio is a tool that is really good for helping kind of build those networks and things, but librarians are also good to work with on those projects because you're developing ontologies, right? You're developing ways of describing things and people, which can become very tricky and problematic too, right? So thinking about ambiguity in our data and that sort of thing is important. Any folks have kind of like an idea of what digital humanities is to them, or the kinds of things you've heard? Like, what do you first think about when you hear that term digital humanities? Are there things that come to mind right away?
Some people even debate, is there a digital humanities?
Yeah.
I suppose I think of new forms of content analysis.
Okay.
Often, not enough probably interrogation about what's going on in the constructions.
Yeah.
Content.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't want to get into too deep, but again, I've been back and forth for since July. Yeah, since and I think we've compromised on the notion of two different answers. One is, and correct me, any listening here, one's capital DH, and the other is lowercase dh. And the lowercase dh is a little more encompassing, and it reaches into social sciences and other areas, whereas the capital DH is much more strictly in the humanities and humanist perspective. And that's about as close as I can get.
Yeah, and I mean, also, I think, to me, capital DH is like people we've identified, that's the kind of the mark of their professional purpose, is to create a language and a discourse around the subfield, which is DH, and to kind of provide people like me, who I think of myself as a lowercase DH, and then I want to use digital tools and have a digital outlook in my work, but don't consider myself a capital DH. I draw on the capital DH people to give me a lens through which to view digital scholarship, a way to talk about it, and then a way to put concerns first. So, if intersectionality is really important to you, you can draw on capital DH people to give you a way to use that as a focus for digital scholarship.
And a lot of the ones that I'm used to become the lowercase dh, folks have anthropologists and archaeologists who are kind of small in the humanities college or humanities area, but they use ArcGIS for their work. And use Trimbles for their work, which makes it very much technology reliant, but at the same time, they're not necessarily application necessarily.
I should also say, I think more positively, on the other side of things, about the Transcribe project at University College London, which is a huge wiki manuscript transcription project, which is enjoying a lot of success.
Yeah, so lots of crowdsourced things, and there's ways that I hope through this presentation and through the breakout sessions, folks will see that a lot of the digital humanities projects that we work on, you have that word digital in it, so you kind of think about, disconnected, or you think about being online, presenting online, but they're really oftentimes very place-based. Like the digital is almost like a Trojan horse to get folks into a place and think critically about that place, or to publish things that aren't digital, but maybe the digital technology enabled, or it's you're thinking critically about the technology. So we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but it's good to get an idea of what folks are interested in and that sort of thing. Are there anyone who's particularly interested in certain topics of DH, or are most people here for a general overview? Is there anyone here who you have a project in mind? Is there anyone else who kind of have a burgeoning project in mind?
Sort of.
You have a little bit of one, right? Or anything? I've all got a little bit, but you have just a little bit of something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't have to share, but we hear all kinds of ideas, so don't worry about it.
Well, my work, I actually got trained in Western Performance Studies.
Oh, okay, so you know Soini.
Yeah, so you have to dance.
Yeah.
I know Western. So I the US as a means of looking at how certain bodies are, how in the US certain bodies seem to be who's deserving of care or not. And that's sort of that dynamic and that how it affects what we're seeing about the refugee crisis right now. So I'm looking at Haitian bodies who migrated in the US in the 1980s at the onset of the AIDS epidemic, and how when they got incarcerated, they were subject to extreme delousing practices because at that time they were also deemed to be the factors of HIV/AIDS. And some of the men developed breast, gynecomastia. And it's a story that got swept under the rug by the U.S. detention centers, and the men filed a lawsuit. And they lost, and that story got swept under the rug, but those practices continued. And so I wanted to do a public history project related to that.
So bringing that story, those voices.
Right, and just figure out another way, because I think academics have tried to write about it, but of course it stays within our own bubble as academics. So how else to bring it back to a larger audience inside and outside of Haiti?
And that's one thing we'll talk about throughout this presentation and then later in the breakout sessions is all the new kinds of literacies that students and faculty learn in these projects, right? Like learning to write for the web, learning to write in tweet form, blog form, or ways in which your much more deeply nuanced arguments have kind of synthesized into these more kind of palatable, sorts of forms. And so aside from learning, technology, they're also learning all these different skills around that and how to present and how to engage with it. So it is very closely linked to public humanities. You had your hands.
Oh, yeah. So my discipline within body aesthetics. So education to look at the way, so people posting in like social media, like Instagram and stuff, using beauty boxes for empowerment. So trying to get the perspective of the people doing it and not just like impose method.
Right. So they get almost an oral history type project. Yeah, we've done several of those and they're really interesting. It can be very robust projects, very big projects, but also very super gratifying and important projects for sure.
So, thank you. All right, so methods. I was just going to, before we get to methods, sort of add my own 2 cents to the question of what is DH, and maybe since I represent a unit on campus that is maybe not as much in the theoretical headspace that Josh might occasionally be in, or maybe that's my own decision, I don't know. We're more of a rubber meets the road unit that is concerned with how we're actually going to bring DH methods to students in actual classes and sort of develop tools for pedagogy. And I know for sure one thing that people look at digital humanities to possibly do, almost as a panacea, is to respond to criticism of what has become a humanities education and its relevance. And I know for a certain time the administration was looking to this concept of digital humanities as being the answer to how do we make humanities education relevant against the competition of, let's say, engineering or something dubbed more practical. That if we simply could give these students more digital skills, humanities would be cool again, right? So what exactly would be these skills that we have to give students that makes the humanities cool again? And so that's kind of how I want to enter this talk of methods, because although we are going to distribute some suggested readings where you'll find a long list that I'll show you of all the possible approaches to DH, I think I might characterize it maybe a set of 5 or so groups of things that we actually do. And I sort of start by talking about this the same way I would talk to my grandparents when they ask me what the heck is digital humanities, right? And I usually start by saying, well, it's like the humanities that you know, where there are people that are looking back sometimes at work that has been made, relics of humanity, and investigating those. And there are people that are sort of concerned with synthesis of new humanistic content, be that literature, art, creative works. So digital humanities has the benefit of being able to address both of these directions with digital tools, whether you're looking at tools that can help you analyze things that have been made, or tools that can help you to create something that you couldn't do before in print. You know, hypertext is a great example of something that's enabled by technology that was not possible before. So one of the first domains for DH methods is text analysis. And you know, this graph I have here is me using, I think, Google's Ngram viewer, where if you're familiar with this tool, it's basically, let's look at all the books that Google has digitized and type in words that we're interested to know about their frequency of occurrence. So I was wondering if I should say I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place or betwixt a rock and a hard place if I was born in the 1600s. Not that anyone would have used these expressions, but if you look at, you know, the way Google has analyzed these texts, I can see there was a point when, okay, betwixt was more popular in print than between. Okay, so maybe that was my year. I should go back to that year and live in that year. But in all seriousness, you know, text analysis has some fun methods that people like to consider. Lemmatization. Any hands for people that know what that means? Okay, you know what that means. Linguists might know what lemmas are, where you basically are looking at the root of words. You know, like you take walking, you'd say, oh, that's the gerund of to walk. So the lemma might be walk for both walk, walks, walking. Word frequency, that's what I've sort of illustrated here. Named entity recognition. Some people just want to give a computer a text and say, tell me all of the proper nouns in this text. And that might seem easy enough, but then, you know, the computer has to be smart enough to know when you're using pronouns, does it still refer to that same entity? Who is the he or the she that's being referred to? And then there's also this notion of tagging. Some people are interested in, let's say, parts of speech. So they'll tag a text with its parts of speech. Is that a verb? Is it a subject? Is it a noun? Text analysis is probably cited as the most frequent origin story for DH. You know, people often give talks about this Italian Franciscan, right? Jesuit monk, Father Roberto Bussa, who, you know, approached IBM saying, I want to index the works of Thomas Aquinas and lemmatize them. And it's sort of cited as the first DH project. So there'll often be a photo of Father Bussa on a slideshow somewhere. However, I was inspired by the recent Chicago Colloquium on Digital Humanities and Computer Science, where the slide was not Father Roberto Bussa, but in fact, here are the women that actually did the work for that project of encoding these punch cards and actually making all the decisions about how to lemmatize the words. So when thinking about text analysis, there's obviously considerations such as these, as who's getting credit, who's doing the work, but also the sort of technical questions of what does it even mean to read the text with a computer, and through what lens do you actually want to do this reading? So you may hear the term distant reading, which is often meant to say, let's give a bunch of text to a computer and see what insights we can have from that vast collection. And that's kind of what we did with my betwixt investigation. Incidentally, this project still exists. It's not like it went into oblivion. But it begets other areas of study. You know, like maybe it's digital humanities starts out with text analysis, but now in the current age, we're looking at how can we analyze sound. This is a project from HIPSTAS called Arlo. HIPSTAS is a NEH-funded group of scholars looking at sound studies, where in this case, I think they're looking at the recitation of a poem by Pound, and the pauses in that poem that can be visualized, and can you sort of infer anything about cadence across recitations of that poem. Some of you may recognize this artwork, which was at the MCA a few years back. And this is actually artwork that represents a movie. The title of this artwork is The Highest Grossing Movie of All Time. Does anyone know what that might have been, let's say, 10 years ago? What the highest grossing movie of all time would have been? Titanic, right? So this artist project was to take every frame of Titanic and average the color to a single pixel and then show it in this sort of linear form. Of course, I'm showing you an artwork here, but you can imagine how the same sort of decision-making might apply to a computer program you would write to sort of say, can I infer any kind of, draw any conclusions from the color, or the tone, or the use of color in films, as it might also correlate to topics of the film or dialogue within the film. So this is still an emerging area of study, and there are all different kinds of tools for looking at video. Second area of methods that our center, thankfully Sergey is here to back me up on this, supports in teaching with classes is this notion of visualization and mapping. And two of the most frequent areas or sub-areas in that we support are these notions of GIS, which is to say Geographic Information Systems, or yes, I think that's it. But basically assigning latitudes and longitudes, coordinates, to data that you have, so that you can somehow see how does this object appear on a map. So we can talk all about how that works technically, but then there are all these questions that deal with deciding what those coordinates are that really are beyond our domain. And that's really what has to be debated. For example, plotting someone's life, how do you assign a single dot to that? And these are the harder questions that you have to answer, not just how do I put a dot on a map. And then another area we looked at that we saw from the slide on Palladio is this idea of network graphing and network analysis. And I remember a few years back there was this very aggressive campaign by Loyola advertising their data science program, and it had these beautiful networks of dots connected to each other. And I thought, that's great, it's so beautiful, but who actually knows how to read that? You know, like, who is teaching people how to read these beautiful visualizations that we see? Or are we being duped by what narrative goes with that, right? So there's this other interest in not only creating these things, but also thinking about how can we teach people to be literate in these visual forms. This is kind of a joke slide, but this is XKCD, the comic, looking at how would they map online communities, and you can sort of see the giant land of Facebook. But it's more or less coming back to what I said a moment ago. What are the languages of visuals that we create, and how do we read them? Because I think we're not spending enough time on learning those. Another domain that our department works with faculty and students on is this notion of archiving, particularly digital archives. So we often think of digital archives in the sort of best form of, maybe you've seen collections held by libraries where you log in and you can see historic documents complete with the metadata that describe them. And maybe you also see with that some notion of an exhibit that has been built with the archive. Literally an analog of the same thing a museum does when it has its collections stored in the back room and occasionally pulls certain things out to mount them on the wall and say, this is our exhibit on this topic based on items we have from our collection. But not all archives are so elaborate. Sometimes, kind of like this visualization of an outdoor archive of a bunch of folders, sometimes I tell faculty, just having things collected on Box or some kind of Dropbox is already a start, right? The act of collecting it and organizing it, maybe you don't need an elaborate software to get started, you just need something. But archiving isn't without its own set of questions too. Namely, there's a lot of interest in creating archives, but one has to wonder what value is assigned to that idea of creating an archive. For example, many faculty like to, this idea that they know they're experts in a particular area and would like to create an archive about that, but then face the criticism of what is the publication in that? So this is where the exhibit can help because it's sort of created a narrative around the objects, but sometimes collecting, it's for the sake of collecting and curating, is often criticized as insufficient, and maybe that's a wrong criticism. And then finally, what we do a lot with, since we are a media and design studio, is a lot with media. And particularly, we look at web, hypermedia, and multimedia for the purpose of digital storytelling. or for what's sometimes as a buzzword called multimodal scholarship, which means simply that what you're producing is not singly in one mode. It's not simply text, maybe it's video, maybe it's sound, otherwise known as multimedia, but maybe that wasn't cool enough, so we had to call it multimodal now. There is a slight difference, but the graphic I have up here is of a game engine called Twine, which is super simple, and it's a screenshot of a very popular game, if you can call it that. Built with that engine, which simply is a choose your own adventure game, and it's an example of someone using a technology to create something that is a nonlinear narrative. It has some sort of direction that you can go that's variable. Along with that, though, a fair amount of what we do in the Media and Design Studio is talk about creation of alternative medias, new medias. Video essay is an example. This is one that we produced with a faculty member at Northwestern on aspects of touch and how that relates to your obsession with your phone and your need to sort of remain in contact with people. So that was my Apollonian, that was my high-level view of work that we do. But as promised, this is the comprehensive list that you might find in a digital humanities textbook for the way it's sort of used as a constellation of methods. I boldfaced things that I kind of touched on, but there are a lot that I didn't. And I'm curious if anybody has a question about what any of these things would be. For me personally, it was, what the heck is a database documentary? So, what is a database documentary? Okay. Does anyone have an idea what that might be? A really boring documentary? I probably should have highlighted that because it's another way of describing, much like you might think of a documentary film covering a topic, what if you simply created a database of information about that topic, like an archive, and allowed the user to navigate it somewhat freely? This, in essence, is the notion of database documentary, is that there is some archival aspect to it, some access that you have to that archive to freely navigate the exploration of a topic, similar to a documentary, except that it's nonlinear. So yeah, lots of options here. Any other sort of things that catch people's interest? Because you're going to be experts in all these one day. Yes, Brian.
Ubiquitous scholarship.
Which one?
Ubiquitous scholarship.
You may have stumped me on ubiquitous scholarship.
I hope you read all these before you asked this question.
Yeah. Let's talk about discrete knowledge production instead.
Ubiquitous.
It was a question we can answer.
That's right.
I mean, I'm guessing it has, this was, so this book is very West Coast DH, which has a lot of like, I kind of, well, not that anyone from West Coast, but I think they use a lot of, like, instead of saying like public scholarship or like, you know, something that's like accessible, I think they're using ubiquity in the sense of like, accessibility of a person. That's my guess. Yeah. There's some, I think a lot of these have kind of buzzwords built into them that are maybe not necessary.
Do a quick Google search. It looks like it's synonymous with digital scholarship.
Yeah.
Digital humanity.
But it's supposed to be interconnectivity with the public humanities, so
Right.
you're on it, Josh.
Yeah.
It's the way to make it permeate through more audiences and to have more of a community feel.
Which is an important concept, right? Because in digital space, people often sometimes equate that with public access to the material and sort of wider access to the material, which has certain implications. You know, one of the things that we face as producers of online content is that we may have a set of readers that otherwise would not have read this material. So it imposes potentially a different set of ethics on the scholarship that we do that would not have applied to writing in a journal, where it had a very controlled and limited audience. Some might say that you almost have a more journalistic set of ethics that you might have to apply for a public-facing project on the web. But that's definitely a concern. But once you've had all these buzzwords, you can maybe collect them and build a bingo sheet similar to this Dilbert cartoon where he sends someone to a meeting to sort of say, here's the bingo sheet. If you crossed off all the things that are mentioned in the meeting, you get bingo. But now you can have bingo on DH with the previous slide content. So on process.
So in between, so the rest of the presentation after this section will be about projects that we've worked on and some of the pros and cons that around them, how they were made, but also some of the issues we confronted in them. And then we'll do a quick rundown of some common tools. But one of the things I think that often gets elided in digital humanities is thinking about process, thinking about the ways in which we're building our teams, interacting with our content, thinking about public and audience. So I want to spend a little bit of time on that. So one of the first things I learned when I first started working in digital humanities space is that folks often come to you wanting a tool. They want something, they want to be able to magically turn something into something else, or they want an answer. And the thing I do in my consultations, especially with faculty and graduate students, I always begin with research questions. I want to understand, what are you researching and why? What are the questions you're interested in? And let those, over time, define what tools we use, what methods we use. Because you can very quickly hit a wall if you apply the wrong tool, the wrong method. And these tools and methods are not, simple answers. And we'll talk a little bit more about how they can be used to negotiate your research questions as well. And similarly in the classroom, right? We want to think about learning goals and outcomes. Sometimes it might simply be I want to provide my students with learning a technical skill or develop a digital project. And other times it might be more about thinking critically about maps, and therefore we're going to use this technology and see how it fails at certain things. And in the beginning of projects, it's really important that you have knowledge and expertise sharing, so that the collaborations are true collaborations. There's lots of literature out there in digital humanities about DH is not a service, right? It's a collaborative enterprise, and that's when it succeeds the best. So, working with scholars, I take time to read in their field and to listen to them and what they're interested in. Likewise, I try to find ways to bring my knowledge and share it with them, and so we have this kind of like synthesis that's a great foundation for the projects we're going to build. Not every project is like that. Some projects are more service model, and that has to do with everything from personality to time and those sorts of things. But I think the ones that succeed the most, like the Poulter project, where folks were really immersed in the poems. They were confronting technology in new ways they weren't comfortable with before, and really coming to a common understanding and common language. It's almost like a translation issue. And to always keep in mind from the beginning the project objectives, right? Like not only the research questions, but what are your goals for these things? Is it going to be a public project? Is it have certain audiences? Is it something that's more just for your monograph publication that we don't need to think about a public component to? So keeping those in mind. Keeping in mind the fact that you're going to be collaborating, you're going to be building a team, so what would that take? Sometimes that's conceptual building of teams, because you might not have all the resources you need. Sometimes it will be thinking about getting grants and other kinds of funding to bring people into the project, or to collaborate across institutions who might have different kinds of support. So constantly getting out of that kind of mindset of doing a project on your own, and how can I build this team, and that can go a long way, building a team properly to having a successful project. Because really a lot of these projects we're thinking about everything from design to content to interactivity. So there's all these kinds of things that no one person is going to be well versed on. Well, maybe they're out there, but no one person is probably going to be well versed on. So how can you bring the best folks in?
Not being available to a scholarship.
Yeah. And don't forget to do certain things, like when you have, let's say you have a data set, let's say you have a list of authors in the journals they published in, and you want to think about how I want to display this network visually. Like, use the tools that you're working with, like Palladio or your spreadsheet, to think about your data dialectically, to think critically about it, to say, okay, I have defined my authors in this way. But now as I try to visualize it this way, I actually need something else. I need to find another field or another thing that defines them, or I need to think about where they're from or where they died or those sorts of things. So constantly negotiating the fact that the data that you start with is probably not the data you're going to end with, because these tools are there to help you kind of think more critically and more closely about what you're working with. And you're going to find ways in which you're going to expand that data set. We're also thinking about considering and learning digital literacies, so building in time to actually sit down with tools and learn them. And one of the things we do in classrooms is that we try to have open labs for most of our classes, which is just students who are working in a specific tool on their project, and they just have free time to just play and to ask questions. And that's a really important thing. Not every faculty member we work with will learn the digital tools that are taught in the class or are used in their project, but we try as much as possible to build a culture of ownership on those projects and to really enforce learning these tools and methods. And then be sure to acknowledge and support project labor, right? Like the projects sometimes that we do, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we have kind of a lab model for our projects, right? Where the students are working on projects that are feeding into a faculty research project. And how can you best acknowledge that labor? How can you best pay for that labor? And making sure we're not creating like exploitative systems of labor as well. So there's a really great document I think we shared in our recommended resources called the Student Bill of Rights out of UCLA, which was written by undergrads who do digital managed projects. And it's a really great way to start thinking about how do I acknowledge the labor in these projects and how do I bring that to the fore and make sure people are getting more than just the classroom experience or learning the tools as their payoff. And finally, to consider and confront the different things that the digital forces us to confront or that brings to the fore that already exists in our society. So thinking about intersectionality in the digital space, thinking about issues of access. And whenever I say access, I don't think just about like being able to log on and download a PDF. I think about the person who needs to use a screen reader. Is your project legible to that person who needs to play it in audio form? Or if you're working, say, in archaeology right now, which I am with a graduate student, and she's working in Peru into areas that the phone plans they buy, most people buy, have Facebook and WhatsApp. You can have unlimited data if you stay on Facebook and WhatsApp, but otherwise you don't have really much access or bandwidth. So how can you create websites that are low bandwidth, don't have massive images and databases behind them so that folks can access them very easily in low bandwidth situations? So thinking about anything from the way race and gender plays out online, going back to the Algorithms of Oppression book that I mentioned earlier, to thinking about these kinds of access issues. The materiality and ecological effects are also present, so thinking about the ways in which all of the things we're storing exist somewhere and take up space and take up electricity and take up water and take up things that are playing into climate change, especially as we more rapidly kind of photograph everything and those sorts of things. And also think about privacy, safety, and non-digital alternatives. And what I mean by that is when we teach classes that will have a student participating in public or performing in public in some way in a digital project, thinking about making sure you're understanding where those students are coming from, making sure they can use a pseudonym if they want to, if they don't want to participate with their full name in public, or in some cases, handing in a non-digital assignment. So finding alternatives to the digital component for folks. And that could be for issues of privacy and safety and security. It could be also for issues of, I'm certainly glad that the articles I wrote as an undergrad in the newspaper are not public. They might someday be digitized and put up that way, but thinking about those sorts of things for students, lasting impact of their participation online. And it could do anything, like we've had students before who, through ADHD or similar things like that, the digital space was a very hard space to focus on, and so finding little outlets and other kinds of assignments that allow folks to conceptualize. So let's say they get tripped up on the technology. Well, draw me what you would have done, or write about what you would have done, because our classes are not technology learning classes for the most part. The goal is not, you're not taking a map making 101 class.
text, you're taking a map about this specific field or this specific content, and you're also learning these digital tools. So making sure there are these kind of safety valves for students to participate in alternative ways. And so before we get to some of the projects that we've worked on, I just wanted to run through some common tools, and I think we mentioned most of these in the handouts, and probably some of them you've seen before. Well, first, I guess I say, were there any questions about the process part? I wanted to open that up. Okay. So some very common, and all these tools are fairly common in digital humanities. They're also online, they're free to use. So this one is called Voyant, and this is a great place to get started if you're interested in text analysis. So let's say you have a single novel or a series of novels. For instance, this is Jane Austen's corpus here, so all of Jane Austen's novels are represented in this visualization. You can really easily, if you have digital text in PDF or a Word doc or a URL that's posted somewhere online, you can very easily input it into the software, and it's going to create this kind of workbench automatically for you. And so you have things that we're all probably used to seeing, like word clouds. You have some very basic facts about the document, so like what are the words that are most used, what's the vocabulary density of the different novels, those sorts of things. You always have access to the full text, which is a very important humanist kind of intervention into this space. So a lot of text analysis tools come from the social sciences, and they're working with documents at such breadth that going back to the original text and the original content of a single word usually gets wiped away. So they're saying, I have 100,000 documents of government documents. I just want to know, like, generally what are these about? And I'm going to run algorithms to spit out topics called topic modeling to say, okay, these documents are vaguely about these kinds of things based on the words and their proximity to each other. What humanists have been doing, and this was designed by digital humanists and computer scientists, is making sure we don't lose context and we don't lose the ability to do close reading at the same time we do distant reading. So I think it's a really great thing that Voyant includes the original text. Over here you can have like some visualizations of word trends. You can do like relative frequencies. So you can say, okay, in Jane Austen's novel, this word appears, maybe they appear the same amount. Say the word appears 12 times in this novel and 12 times in that novel, but actually relatively appears a lot more in this other novel because of the density of it or that sort of thing. So you can kind of start to see patterns and trends that way potentially. And then the concordance tool, which is kind of like the baseline for most analysis, especially if you're thinking about language. So you could pull up a person's name and see what words appear to the left and right of that name every time they're mentioned, and start to see kind of. And this tool is really great, not so much about like you put in a text and it spits out answers or shows you patterns, but it allows you to kind of like refine your questions. And what I use it with students mostly for is to help them read and see in new ways. So we all have a way in which we read, and we don't necessarily we're not necessarily self-critical in how we're reading. So by putting a text into here, you can maybe focus on a word that only appeared once and you didn't really notice why you didn't notice it the first time as you read it. So why did that one word only appear once? Not just focusing on the major words, but also the things that might not be there at that first blush. Yeah.
Is there a way to apply this tool to the existing sizable digital archive?
Yes and no. Well, yes, you can upload a corpus of documents, but it is so. Some of the limitations of these things are going to be that they're browser-based, right? So it's only as strong as your browser. So if you're working with like hundreds of thousands of documents, it's probably going to have a hard time working on that.
Yeah, it's about hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
I'm thinking there's a nice archive in history of economic thought that this guy put together at NYU, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't tell you how many texts, but I'm guessing about, 100,000.
Yeah. I mean, as long as you can export from that archive in a way that Voyant can read. So if you have a folder of PDFs or a folder of text files, you can do that. If you can't do something as simply as like point to the location of the website and it knows what to bring in. But if you can export any kind of document, textual document, you can use Voyant for it.
And now increasingly, like if you use a lot of library databases like Gale and EBSCOhost and those sorts of things, they're building their own kind of like Voyant type tools on top of it. So you could do text analysis on, or HathiTrust, which is a non-profit archive. They have tools built on there to do that kind of stuff. But those are only as usable as you needing their actual corpus. So.
A great starting point.
Yeah, it's a very great start. So StoryMap.js, which we'll do a breakout session on a little later, is a great simple tool from Knight Lab at Northwestern. And Knight Lab is out of the journalism school, so they're very invested in storytelling. And they've created different tools, from timeline tools to story map tools, to help you tell stories spatially. So this is an example of a recent publication by Patty Lowe and her students on creating an indigenous tour of Northwestern. So they've done a lot of extensive research on finding ways, like indigenous traces on campus, talking about different controversies around certain people and places and things, and just kind of like illuminating that space in a new way. And we can talk about that more in the breakout session. But anything from like presenting something alternatively. It could be as simple as I want to use that instead of PowerPoint, right? To like kind of show my argument. But also it's great for spatial and place-based storytelling, or bringing in popular media. You can bring in you can bring in YouTube videos, you can bring in Wikipedia entries, sometimes tweets, things like that. So there's a good synchronicity with that. And it's also just kind of fun and engaging and user-friendly. And I think people are starting to use them more and more in popular media. And I think people automatically know when they see something like this, okay, I can like scroll and navigate or click on a point. So Omeka, which we mentioned briefly before, is a great place to build an archive of things, especially an archive of things that you want to describe in depth. So Omeka allows you to bring in, say you have a picture of a statue, and you want to create an archive of statues, and you want to have users be able to sort them by time period, or by theme, or by the person who created the statue. Omeka allows you to create the metadata around those items, and then create an archive that's online, and searchable, and sortable in very robust ways. It also allows for the curation of exhibits. So we have classes where we already have an archive created, and the students come in and they work in that archive and in special collections, we'll talk about this in a minute, and curate that archive. So a lot of DH projects, just like the 1,000 dots on a map, or the big visualization, are unreadable, kind of illegible, and kind of therefore inaccessible. So how can we find ways to curate this archive to make sense of it for folks who are just going there for the first time? And folks also like Omeka because it's participating in a community of practice. So it was developed in the digital humanities by digital humanists, and is used by libraries, archives, museums, and other institutions a lot. So there's really great documentation on it, and really great user community around it as well. And I think last tool I want to show is Scalar. So Matt mentioned web and hypermedia. This is a really great tool for doing multimodal presentation, and Scalar really sees the tool as a book publishing platform, but it can be many other things. And it's a really great way to very easily kind of link text to images, have little pop-ups and hovers, so if you want to define words or you want to provide more information about people and places and things that appear in your text, you can do that. You can have the images scroll along with the text it's associated with. They have really great annotation tools, so let's say you have a video in there, but you want to annotate that video, you can do that as well. So it's a really great way to kind of bring in lots of different kinds of media, make sense of it together, and present an argument or present a narrative. And it's also has some other features, like you can kind of like visualize your narrative based on the themes you've tagged on the pages. And it's also nonlinear. So you can create different paths. Like let's say I'm reading a certain page about somebody, and one of the paths it's on is feminism, and I want to go down that path. I can go down the path where every page that mentions that theme goes. So it's kind of like a choose your own adventure type of thing. Was that multilinear? Yeah, multilinear would be the fancier way of saying it, but it really is. Yeah, and so it just kind of at first kind of like participate in this kind of death of the author theory, right? Like where the reader has has supremacy, but it's become increasingly more used in a more coherent way too. I think people are learning how to write with Scalar. In the past, I would go to a Scalar site and be like, did I finish it? Did I read all of it? I don't know. But people are getting better, I think, in learning how to tell narratives and stories. And just last, a plug for the DH Toy Chest, which is Alan Liu's really great website where he collects digital humanities tools and software, writes little reviews of them and links them to different projects. And if you're interested in text analysis or visualization, it's a great place to start just to kind of find what tools are out there, what people are using and why. And I think he even keeps up, but makes a note of tools that have kind of come and gone, so you can kind of get a history of digital humanities here in this space as well. And I need to speed up a little bit, but just some things to consider when you're looking at a tool. How accessible is it, right? Like who has access to it and how? Who developed it? It was developed out of the Digital Humanities Lab. Does it come from the social sciences? Is it a for-profit company? Those sorts of things. What can I bring into and take out of it? So there are many tools like Palladio, which we'll see. You can't export your visualizations very well. You can export like some thing called JSON, which people may or may not know how to use. But a lot of times your data becomes trapped in these tools, and it's a great research tool, but then doesn't become a presentation tool. So thinking about those sorts of things, thinking about how good the documentation is, and who is already using it, because that will show you there's a community of practice around it, and you can kind of rely on that tool for years to come, and always get answers when you confront problems. I'm going to turn over to Matt to talk about some of our projects.
Yeah, so we've seen some of the tools, and a few of these actually get implicated in projects that we build. So I have this comic up here, which I'll just let you maybe read briefly. So it's often hard to tell the difference between something that is going to be simple in the digital space versus something that is complex. You know, if we simply replace CS with DH, we have the same story all over again. And we're just as guilty as that. We should be, as practitioners in the space, aware of what it's going to take to do something, but sometimes we underestimate the effort. And the first project I want to talk about is a visualization project that we collaborated with someone from the Department of French and Italian on, who came in and said, I am teaching this novel on Les Miserables, and one of the things I struggle with is since there are so many characters in this novel, giving students a way to visualize who is in it, who is connected to whom, what are the communities there. So she actually went out on the internet and looked for depictions of the novel, and lo and behold, she found these network graphs. I don't know if you see on the screen here. The only problem is that these network graphs were created by a data set from someone who is not a literary scholar. And the other problem is, nothing against Don Muth from California about creating these data sets. He had in mind sort of like a demonstration of the network graphing technology when he made it. He wasn't trying to be fully accurate, but it became a gold standard for all these people developing these algorithms to detect communities. So she came to us to say, number one, I'd like to correct this data set, and number two, I'd like to get better visuals for the characters of this book. So in that, she had to actually go through and read the novel, which is quite long, and document all of the encounters between the characters, and she did it in a way that looks similar to what you see on the left. And following that, we used a series of tools to create these graphs, one of which I don't mention here, but I'll name it. It's called Gephi, G-E-P-H-I, which is I would characterize it as an entry-level network graphing tool. And in fact, one of the data sets that is in Gephi when you open it is this faulty Les Miserables data set that everyone uses. So you can see the wrong one, I guess, when you open Gephi. And if you want to download the correct one, you could go to our website and download the correct one. But one thing that did occur, even though she had corrected the data set, and we ran these very complex computer science theoretical algorithms to detect the communities of characters, we got a photograph of the results similar to what you see in the end product, but she did not agree with what the computer had sort of done to group people together. Like you see people in orange and in purple, and there were some nuances where I don't really understand why this character is here, they should really be over here. And that became a really interesting point to enter this discussion of, okay, well, what assumptions was the computer making that you know, or that it doesn't know that you know? And, you know, it comes down to this limitation of what is the data that you've distilled in making this thing. So our solution to that, of course, was just forget what the algorithm says, we'll just fix it manually. That's what we did. The second thing you've heard about, second project you've heard a lot about, is the Poulter Project. And this is a digital editions project to show the poetry of Esther Poulter, who, to sort of name her quickly, was a woman writing in relative seclusion in the 1600s, about 30 miles north of London, on an estate who had 15 children and thus spent about 11 years of her life pregnant, and meanwhile wrote 120 awesome poems with no apparent intent to necessarily have them published. Maybe she wrote them for her family, no one really knows. But these were sort of discovered, and the significance of them was appreciated only very recently, in the 90s. And she's not very well known, so scholars at Northwestern and elsewhere decided to launch this project to see if we could get this work into the canon. And part of that challenge would be getting this work into the canon digitally if we're going to make a website, and sort of asking ourselves, what is the implication of publishing something for the first time digitally? In fact, I have on the screen here this notion of peer review. A lot of those people wouldn't participate as editors unless the site that we produce could be peer reviewed, because this had to count for promotion and tenures. And this is another challenge in digital projects that we've seen is, for the work that you do on a given digital project, how will it be valued by your administration when it comes time for promotion and tenure? The technology that we used at the basis was something called TEI, or the Text Encoding Initiative, which is just a way of sort of marking up the original poetic text in a way that looks like this. Kind of looks like HTML if you've seen that. Only to wind up with a very beautiful result that includes not only access to the poems and headnotes, but also to these sort of related pieces of the anthology that are sort of on the topics discussed in the poems, and these are called curations. Third project I want to mention is the Chicago Mural Movement, in part because if you'd like, you can take a closer look at this in a breakout session. But this represents an archive that was created for a class and a public exhibit. The basis of which was the Omeka software that Josh mentioned. But on top of that, for which we created a custom presentation layer that enabled mapping and the inclusion of student mapping projects, or sort of student story maps that you can see here. So it started from a collection that we obtained from the U of C, actually came with the professor that came to Northwestern. You know, this is also another question in DH, is what happens when someone moves from institution to institution? Does their digital portfolio come with them or not? In this case, it did. We corrected this data and built something with it. But the question that we had that we failed on is we corrected data, but we didn't actually send it back to the origin. So in this sense, we were not good stewards. Maybe there's still hope that we can still do this. And then on Open Door, another project
that we've worked on in the past is Open Door Archive, which is Professor Harris Feinstein and John Cutler in the English department. And the beginning of this project, it was very much an archive of multi-ethnic avant-garde poetry, hemispheric poetry from the Americas that was in print originally, but kind of has become out of print. So issues like El Corno Emplumado, the complete run of that. We worked with editors and poets and artists to secure the rights to create this entire archive of these, they're called little magazines of poetry. So we had an archive of several magazines, very robustly built so that you could search the PDFs and see metadata about them. But we also wanted to find ways to curate this archive. And so one of the things we did was we developed a class with Harris Feinsod for undergraduates where they worked purely in special collections. So every class session was in special collections, and the job of 1 or 2 students each class session was to kind of curate the ephemera they had found in our special collections that related to a topic or a poet or a poem or an artwork in the Open Door archive. And so students were actually working in Omeka to search the archive, to kind of learn more about it, to read poems, to look at art and find a subject, and then work within special collections to curate it. So they were doing scholarly research, scholarly humanistic research. And their final product was a multimedia essay that would exist on the website. So along with the archive being a bunch of items, there's also these curations that can help people make sense of it or understand why it's important around different themes. And it eventually kind of became almost like a publication model. So the undergraduates working in this classroom to create these articles. Harris was hiring graduate students to then work on those essays editorially, but also to kind of bring in other collections and that sort of thing. So unfortunately, the class has only been taught once. The classes that are taught multiple times are much more effective at building the archive, but we're still adding in journals. But one big issue was this issue of undergraduate labor and acknowledgement. And we're on the quarter system. I don't know if you all are on the quarter system or not, but we have more or less 10 to 12 weeks of class time per quarter, like 10 weeks of class. So the student work often is not ready for prime time or for public consumption. And so that's one of the issues we've confronted with this is the student work has not been made public yet. And how do we capture students to participate in the editing after the class is over? How do we get them, and for some of our digital humanities projects, students will take whatever they've built in it and turn it into a senior thesis. But most students, they take the class and they're out, and that's that. So we're still working on how to best incorporate the student work in the final public project. So there are some exhibits and curations on there, but they're by scholars or artists or poets who were involved in these journals. And lastly, this is a project I worked on years ago with a graduate student in English who had 2 novels she was interested in. They were basically the same novel. One was from 1811, the other one was from 1859, and they were by Sidney Morgan, or Sidney Lady Morgan. And the scholarship, and she had revised this novel at some point, republished in 1859. And a lot of the scholarship or common understanding about this novel was that she edited it to kind of like make it more concise in 1859. And it was mostly about, in 1811 it was serially published, and so she used, lots of language to like fill out the pages, or maybe she was paid by word or something like that. And so there wasn't a lot of critical engagement with the different editions. And what Jade really wanted to do was to compare them like very meticulously. And so we used this tool called Juxta, which is online and free to use. It's a collation tool. And you can upload both texts, and it automatically is going to find differences and changes and edits, and then highlight those for you. So it became a very powerful tool, and as she started to see at scale and from a distance where the novel had been changed the most, and also doing close reading, she realized that a lot of the language and a lot of the themes were changed based on the colonial wars that had happened in England and India and those sorts of things. That there are really meaningful reasons why the novel was edited. And so she was able to come up with some really great arguments through this. And just as a quick aside, collation software has existed for decades. I think Newberry has one. There are these collation machines, like these giant metal things, and you stick your head in, and the pages are kind of like holographically hovered over. And they never became popular because almost everybody who used them puked, because it was just too visually disorienting. So one of the biggest issues for this project was that we had to do a lot of processing of the text and cleaning up the text. So we found the text on the Internet Archive, so we could download them freely. But the 1811 version used a much more ornate font that software has a hard time reading. And also, the scans weren't that good, so there were ink blots and different kinds of creases and things. So we spent a lot of time, luckily the corpus was only 2 novels, so we could kind of do manual editing. But there is a lot of upfront, like I show a tool like Justa and it looks magical and great, but then you're like, okay, I have to actually spend a lot of time processing my text to make sure they're readable for these sorts of things. And then another issue, or I don't know if it's an issue necessarily, is just thinking about graduate professionalization. So one thing Jade did on this project, because we hired her in the library to work on it, was to create documentation so that future students could use a tool like this within our department. So finding ways in which we can support graduate students, but not just make them workers on our projects, but also enable them to work on their own projects as well, but also contribute back to the discipline. So just to wrap up, because I think we're over time, all of this work kind of comes to a head and kind of comes to some sort of unified form in our work in our digital scholar and the digital humanities summer workshop that we do every year. And we cover all these different topics with faculty for 2 weeks, whether it's learning digital skills and literacy. Matt teaches a really amazing class on HTML and data and metadata, just learning the very basics of how to create databases, to thinking about team building, to thinking about how to build a syllabus. So this year we're purely pedagogy focused, so everyone's going to walk away from it with a syllabus or with a good outline of a syllabus for a course. We bring in guest speakers, we talk about ethical issues, and we have a lot of unstructured work time, which is always important, just to let people explore and play and fail and try again, and those sorts of things. And so we hope in those 2 weeks and hopefully in these few hours that we're able to kind of turn that shrug of emoticon into a smiley face. So that's our goal usually, is just to get people to feel comfortable with it. And a lot of folks come in and they take it, they're interested, but they're nervous to teach the class or they're nervous to do the project because they don't feel well versed in the technology. And we just try to work to demystify that and to make sure that everyone can kind of talk and learn and share at a base level and be successful with their project. So thank you very much for our time. We have.
So I don't know, I can lead us off with an anecdote. We have an advisory committee for our group, which, as you know, is now focused on digital products. Our representative from the library asked us, why aren't we just making books? Because the entry point was, we know how to preserve books. We've done it for hundreds of years, but the precariousness of digital projects is obvious. Like, you go to use something on the internet, it's not there anymore, it relies on some server. So I think the only thing that we've been doing lately as a trend to try to address preservation and make it more viable is to, whenever possible, decouple the need for some kind of hidden backside to something, like some notion of, oh, that's on the server, or that's in the database. The more you can expose to something that actually gets downloaded by a browser, the more archivable and sort of portable it is, right? And that's a big way of looking at preservation. But in general, I think preservation of digital projects is like one of the most planned or underappreciated aspects of the projects, because people will come up with elaborate plans with great funding to implement something, but no plan for ongoing preservation.
And there's a debate happening right now about what's the most important thing to preserve. Is it the documentation about the project? Is it the source code of the project? All those things are important. Odds are, in a lot of our work, we don't have a lot of time to document the projects as we go along because we're working in these weird time frames that academia presents us, right? Like, we have, faculty members in town for a week, and then on Saturday, we have these weird time frames. So we do different things. We do web archiving for all of our public projects. So we have an archive instance, which is the same thing that InterArchive uses to create the Wayback Machine and archive. So we can archive things and see how they exist in time. It's not always going to capture all the functionality of an interactive site like that, but we've done different things over the years. There's a really great tool called Web Recorder, which has come out of more of the art scene, which allows you to kind of record your browser sessions, and then it creates an archive of that through like editing video too. So we have different techniques. We've done everything from like screen captures to using GitHub to have posted source code and stuff like that, but it's still kind of all over the map, and each project is so radically different oftentimes that it's hard to say, okay, for every project like this, we do this kind of preservation. For a project like this, we do that. So it goes on to all of that.
So how do you feel about, intellectually, about trying to preserve a project? We had a conversation about this the other day. Present a project that is interactive in a format such as what you're trying in the browser or whatnot, where each time you experience that project, it's potentially 100% different.
It's a second reading almost.
Yeah.
It's not a first reading or a first source, it's like a secondary source at that point, right?
I mean, there's sometimes we just present the hard realities, right? Like, I think as a librarian, as someone also working in the digital space, it's kind of ideological push that or belief that everything can be saved and everything should be saved, which I don't think is true. I think ephemerality is what makes us human, right? I know Silicon Valley's trying to solve death, but and so one of the things we do sometimes, we say, okay, we're going to have an MOU in this project. We're going to say it was up for 5 years or up for 10 years. And after that, we'll have another negotiation. We'll talk about is there an easy way to migrate. But we confront that annually. Projects that were developed in the 80s or 90s, and I wasn't here. No one in the library participated in building this project. No one knows what the hell it is or how it was made. And sometimes you take them down, and you archive them the best way you can. Books go out of print, any kind of object goes out of print, or you have other editions that aren't quite the same as reading the Shakespeare First Folio, right? So you do your best within that space. But the belief that everything just because it's digital can't be saved, or just because you wrote that library and business that everything should be saved, I think it's something we need to let go of and then kind of start the conversations around having these kind of hard conversations about that, which I'm sure archivists have been having. Newspapers.
So we have some options for breakouts. We are here and we have on the screens 4 topics that we kind of came prepared to talk about and had imagined, one possibility would be having parallel tracks if we divide the room where we could talk about these things and you could choose which of the 2 things at the given time you want to see. But if people object to that, and as we sort of describe what these things are, you say, I'm not interested in that, and everybody says no one wants that, maybe we'll do something different. But the 4 things are looking at things in a more hands-on way. We mentioned Omeka more than a dozen times in the presentation, so I'm offering to lead an hour session looking at Omeka, how that works, uploading some sample data, and talking about the structure of the platform. Josh is offering hands-on for StoryMap.js, and also talking about maps more theoretically in that context. And then following either of those, if we talk about those in parallel, where you could choose either one, I was going to discuss a project that I mentioned, the Chicago Mural Movement, a little more in depth, how that was built, how Omeka is used in that project, and also how StoryMap.js is used in that project. So either session would be sort of helpful for that. And then Josh is offering to talk about access and ethics, especially useful when you have student collaborators on a project.